Hi folks, Matt Easton here, Schola Gladiatoria. Now, most of you know on this channel that I deal with military history, but also general history as well. And something which I've touched on in the past is family history or ancestry. Now, this is something that I did promise I was going to start looking at a little bit more. It is something that I've always been interested in my own life and done quite a lot of research into, it has to be said. And when I've done a couple of videos in the past on this topic, it's clear that there is an appetite amongst some of you to hear more about this. So that's what I'm going to be doing here. So as an opener, I thought it would be interesting to consider, why do I think studying ancestry or family history is interesting or worthwhile? And also very, very light touch, just looking at how do you do it? Now, before I delve into that question of why I think the study of ancestry and family history is worthwhile and important as well to all of us, I think I just want to say briefly that I don't think we should attach too much personal significance for the current day to who our personal ancestors were. Okay, I very much view studying family history and ancestry, yes, it's got a personal side to it, and you will feel an emotional connection to personal ancestors, but it's part of all of our history, and we are ultimately all related. We are all humans and we all share a huge percentage of our common ancestry, and that's a very important thing that we have to recognize. If you just take the United Kingdom, for example, in the early Middle Ages we had a population of about between 2 and 3, 4 million maybe maximum, and now we have a population of 67 million or something. So the very simple factors just within the United Kingdom, and obviously you can apply this to the whole rest of the world. The population has hugely increased, and therefore a huge number of us share common ancestors, and obviously if we go all the way back, we all share the same ancestors. So our ancestral history is connected to each other. That being said, I acknowledge that most normal people are going to get particularly excited if they find a notable or a sort of important or powerful person in their family history. And equally, there might be some people who did reprehensible things or objectively, in modern perspective, evil things in the past that might come up in your researches, who you might feel ashamed of. But you have to remember, you're an individual living in the modern world. Yes, you are connected to those people, but so are lots of other people in the modern world as well. So the first point of why I think it is worthwhile, really worthwhile, studying ancestry and family history might not even be your own. It could be someone else who you're researching, studying their family history and ancestry, is because it's a lens to study the past. What do I mean by that? Well, I'm an antique dealer, and often an antique comes into my possession, and I research the original owner of that antique, and I learn a whole bit of new history. Now, when you're studying your own family history, your ancestors, you very often will find that it will lead you down avenues of historical research that you never would have looked down otherwise. You might find that they did a particular trade, or they lived in a particular place, or they were involved in a particular historical incident or political movement or this kind of thing. And so it gives you a window or a lens into studying one particular specific little bit of history that very possibly you never would have learned about, never would have studied otherwise. Now, the second point that comes to mind is very much connected to this, and that is that doing this, studying family history, your family history or someone else's, it both broadens and deepens your knowledge of history for the same aforementioned reasons. Because first of all, it deepens it because you're now researching specific people in specific places at specific times for which there aren't history books written about. You are doing primary research in history. You're digging through the records, you're recording things, you're collating that information which potentially no one has ever really looked at before or ever really studied before. Okay, so you're massively deepening your understanding of a particular person or group of people within a particular area at a particular time. But also by doing this, because there are many, many people on your family tree, when you collectively do this over and over again with different people, it broadens your understanding of history. So quite simply, you might study one group of working people in a certain area at a certain time and how their lives went, how different shifts in political and economic or military situations affected them in their lives. Scientific as well, medicine advancements, all those sorts of things. You might learn more about that, but then you do it with person after person after person, and when you collect all of that information together, you now find that you have very deep little avenues of research across a broad selection of people, of different social classes. With my own family, for example, I've got lots and lots of very relatively poor working class people, but equally I'm related to kings, and if I go back far enough, emperors. I'll save that for another video. So just within my own historical research, I have ended up studying people at the very top of the social spectrum and at the bottom of the social spectrum, and everything in between, in a broad range of periods across a broad bit of Europe as well, as it happens. So you end up with a really quite a wealth of information across a diverse range of places, times and elements of society. Now, the next reason why I'd say it's really important to study family history and ancestry, not to say you necessarily have to do it, but why it's really important that some people do it, is because it adds to our collective understanding of the past. So everything all the points I've just made in the last couple of points, now think about how that benefits everyone else, rather than people just studying the Plantagenets or whatever, the Georgians, whatever period or dynasty of the people who get lots of books written about them. It means that collectively there are now thousands and thousands of people around the world conducting primary source material research in history and learning things about history which regular historians, a lot of the time, aren't researching and aren't writing about or documenting or sharing. So it means that collectively, people who study family history and ancestral research are collating a huge amount of historical data and sharing it with each other. And remember, I'll just go back to that point, lots of us are interrelated. Okay, the population has boomed in the last few hundred years. So when I'm conducting research of a certain part of my family, that will benefit directly all of the other people who are related to those same ancestors. We have common ancestors, but equally when it touches on broader subjects in history that might relate to changes in society or economics, politics, war, medicine, science, anything else, fashion, art, everything you can think of, it benefits that overall study. Now, the next point I've noted down of why I think studying ancestry and family history research is really important is because it opens minds. A lot of people I've met in my life, and I've been involved in the study of history and archaeology all of my life. I have a history and archaeology degree. A lot of them become entrenched in a certain line of thinking of where they come from and who they are. So, for example, I have met numerous people who've said, oh, my family are from this place and they were whatevers. They were, whether it was cloth makers or farmers or fishermen or lords of the manor or barons or whatever. Okay. Now, the simple fact is we have thousands and thousands and thousands of ancestors. Okay. So you are never the product of one particular place or one particular group of people. You're a product of a range of places, a huge amount of time going back thousands of years, and of course a huge number of different types of people with different professions and at different parts of the social spectrum. Now, when you study the past, whether you just generally study history or archaeology, or when you study family history specifically or ancestral research, you cannot avoid to have your mind opened in this way, because however you've perceived yourself or your family or your past, you will notice that it is a lot more diverse than basically a lot of people realize. So a simple example of this is, in my family, we overall know that we're predominantly English with a little bit of Scottish, and there's a little bit of German way back there. Now, we only know about the German because of family history research, which my father conducted. So that immediately broadens my mind, because that makes me think, well, so I had ancestors in relatively recent history in Germany. But equally, I know that I have ancestors in Scotland. Now, I don't have any personal connection to Scotland at all, apart from that I've worked there a bit. But I know about my Scottish family because I've researched it, and that gets me a little bit more interested in Scottish history and how England and Scotland interacted in positive and negative ways over the centuries. But the fact is that it makes me aware that actually, okay, my family is more diverse than I thought. Well, as we'll get onto in a few minutes, I actually, through DNA research, have found out that I'm a little bit more diverse even than that. But we'll get to that in due course. When you study the facts, when you study historical data, or in some cases scientific data, you often find that actually, whatever narrow vision you'd had of where you come from, it's probably, in most people's cases, it's more diverse than that. Right, so the final point I've noted down, and there are other points you go into, but I want to keep this relatively concise. The reason why I think family history research and ancestral research is really cool and worthwhile, not just for the people who are doing it, but for society at large, is because it increases the degree of enfranchisement in the past. So I've loved history my whole life. I've studied history. However, a lot of people, you say the word history and their brains turn off because they don't feel a personal connection to it. You know, oh, what do I care about how many wives Henry VIII had? What do I care about, the poor laws or the Industrial Revolution? They don't feel a personal connection to those things because that's way in the past, it's happened, it's gone, it's not going to change. But I strongly believe that when you start personally connecting with people who you know might be your 4 times great grandmother or grandfather, then that enfranchises you in this historical period. What affected them? Why did they die so young? Why did they end up in a poorhouse? Or why did they end up ruling that country? Or why did they end up in India? What were they doing in India in the 19th century? Or whatever. So it enfranchises people, it connects them personally to the past. And why is that important? Why is that a good thing? Well, quite simply, I strongly, fundamentally believe that the study of history is important for our future. Okay? The old adage, those who don't learn from the past are doomed to keep repeating the same mistakes in the future. If we're ever going to improve humankind's lot in existence, in life, and make things better for everyone, we have to learn about past mistakes. You cannot ignore past mistakes, or you shouldn't ignore past mistakes, we often do, and therefore enfranchising people in the study of history under the guise of, well, not really under the guise, but basically making it personal to them, increases, hopefully long term, the chances that they will go, well, my ancestors really suffered under that regime, or my ancestors did really well living in that place because they had a really great government that did this, that and that, might hopefully mean that we can find better solutions and better options for solving our problems in the future. Now, in the second part of this video, and I'll keep this fairly concise because I'll do future videos in far, far more detail on this particular topic. I have actually personally been emailed and messaged on various social media platforms by numerous people after I've done ancestry related videos asking me, Matt, I really want to research my history, my family history, my ancestry, how do I do it? So that is a massive, massive question that I can't fully answer in this video, but I'm basically going to say there are 2 main things you can look at. Number 1 is records, historical records. Number 2 is scientific data in the form of DNA. Now, I'll come to DNA second. First of all, records. Fundamentally, it depends partly where you live as to how lucky you will be as to how many records there are. I am extremely lucky being a British person because British records are not only extremely complete, we have never, or not really since the English Civil War, we've not had any major events in British history that have destroyed wholesale lots of records, but equally very good records were being made for lots of people from the Elizabethan period onwards. Fantastic records were kept basically for every end of society from the 18th century onwards. So many, many people in Britain or from Britain originally, or with part of their family from Britain, can trace their British family back to the 1700s. Okay, it's often, with some exceptions, it's often not that difficult to trace some of your family back to the 1700s through widely available records. Back to the 1600s is more difficult, but again, it's not that unusual. Beyond the 1600s and back into the Middle Ages, it's more unusual, and really you need to be related to someone who was seen by that society as worth recording. So someone essentially aristocracy or quite wealthy or powerful. Coming forward in time, the reason also why British people are very, very lucky is because we've got great digital records that have been shared through a number of different resources. So obviously we've got the British Library, we've got the National Archive, Public Records Office, but we've also got a series of websites which have used British records, things I've spoken recently about the British Newspaper Archive, but we have things like Ancestry, we have the website, we have Find My Past, we have My Heritage. So we've got a number of different websites which draw upon the data which British institutions have initially kept and now digitized. Now, what if you're not British, or indeed what if, just a general advice for anyone else? Fundamentally, you're going to be reliant on records for finding at least the last 100 years or hopefully 200 years of your ancestry. You need access to as many names, dates and places as you can get. Okay, so the initial advice, whether you're British or from anywhere else, is you should know the full names of your parents, and if possible the full names of your grandparents, and preferably their dates of birth, their precise dates of birth, and even better, their places of birth. Okay, if you have got all 4 of your grandparents, even better if you've got all 8 of your great grandparents, and with their full names, their birth dates and their birthplaces, then you stand a chance of being able to get back further. But that's the initial stage. So if you're starting out from scratch, you want to go to your parents, your grandparents, assuming that you're in contact with them, and get that data. Once you've got that data, then you can start looking at online researches for going back further, online resources for going back further. If you don't have online resources for the country or the place that you're from, then you have to do what my father did before the age of the internet, and that is look into things like church records or medical records or state government records if you can get access to them. So a lot of countries and a lot of places will have systems for accessing church records of births, deaths and marriages, and even in the UK with modern digitised resources, they're still the primary records. The records of births, christenings, marriages and deaths, usually in that order. So churches kept those records. Sometimes centrally governments kept those records either instead of or in addition to. So getting access to those. Sometimes also you might find there are other historical documents which mention those individuals. It might be deeds, for example, possession of property, legal cases, if someone's been to court, things like this. And you can find some of that by internet searching. So that's a brief overview, records, but the first step is to make sure you've got written down and recorded the names, birth dates, death dates, if that's applicable, and places of all your known ancestors. Put that down first, then start searching for extra data. Now, DNA. This is something that's come along in recent years, and I was actually at university studying archaeology with friends of mine who started doing some of the earliest DNA research in the British Isles anyway, into our collective ancestry, and specifically they were looking to see traces of the Germanic invasions of Britain after the fall of the Roman Empire, so quite specific. Now, DNA research in terms of familial, sort of closer family, within the last 1,000 years, DNA profiling is something which is much more recent, and the first thing you have to say about it is completely based on data. Okay, so they can record DNA results from lots of different places, and then based on data and statistics, they can estimate, and it's only an estimate, they can estimate what proportions of your DNA ancestry come from which places. And it's constantly changing, and it's quite a young science. Okay, so a huge amount of caution has to be used when we're talking about DNA analysis of our ancestral composition, as a lot of these websites will call it. Now, I have done 2 DNA tests. I have done Ancestries and I have done 23andMe, and they broadly give some overlapping similar results, but there are also some very notable differences. Now, I will talk about these in future videos in more detail, but the reason I wanted to do both is because I have a personal scientific interest in that data. I was involved in, well, I wasn't involved, but I was sort of sitting adjacent to people who were involved in DNA analysis of ancestry back in the day, 25 years ago, and I'm still interested in it now, and it's moved on a long, long way. But it's still a young science. It's still a young science, and it's only as good as the data that's fed into the system. The more data goes in, the more accurate the results that can be concluded or estimated coming out. Okay, that's the first thing to say about it. Secondly, different services, different websites will give you different results. I wanted to do both because I wanted to see if they corroborated or if they contradicted. Additionally, I did have a personal desire to do DNA DNA ancestral composition report, because during my traditional family history researches, I'd found a part of my family who may have had a non-European input, and I wanted to see if that showed up in the DNA. And now I'd always thought about doing it, but that was the final thing that pushed me over the edge and went, you know what, I'll do a 23andMe test, which is the first one I did, to see if it shows up a non-European component which would corroborate a possible bit of research I'd been working on in the historical records. As it turned out, it didn't. It wasn't useful at all. But nevertheless, it did get me interested, and it made me think, hey, I wonder what Ancestry's report would look like in comparison to this. So I went and did that one as well. That's info for another video for another day. Now, just to conclude, I'll say there are flaws to both of these systems of research. So on one hand, we've got researching historical records, and on the other hand, we've got DNA data. Okay. Now, the main flaws of searching the historical records is, firstly, it might be lacking. You might just not have the historical records surviving, or you might not be able to access them currently. They might become available in the future. But secondly, you don't know for certain that just because someone wrote that person X was the son or daughter of person Y, that they actually were. And this is an elephant in the room with researching family history from records, is that there are a lot of illegitimate people in the world, and there have been in the past. So just because someone's recorded as the son or daughter of someone doesn't mean that they necessarily are. If that person is not the actual son or daughter of the person you thought they were, then all of the family tree above that is irrelevant to them, because it's not their real, I mean, in cultural terms you could say it's relevant to them and their beliefs and things like that, but in biological terms it's irrelevant to them because they're not related to that person. So those are two issues with the records. The records might be wrong, they might be missing, and the person who's recorded as a child of the next person might not be. But the flaw of DNA data is a different kind. Firstly, your DNA is your DNA, okay? So you can, from any of these services, I think any of them, certainly 23andMe, you can extract a raw DNA report. And that's an interesting thing to have. However, you or I probably have no way to do any kind of analysis with that raw DNA data, okay? It gets fed into a machine, and that machine is only as good as the data set it has to draw upon and estimate things from. So it's all estimates, percentage estimates. Now, you've got two elements. The main element of problem here is the flaw of DNA analysis. Okay, the way that machine analyzes that data might be flawed, it might be wrong, and it's changing all the time. So since I took my 23andMe test about 3 years ago, the ancestral composition has changed constantly. Now, number one, I love that it changed constantly, and why does it change? Because they're having more and more and more data put into it, and they're refining how they analyze it. But for someone who's a researcher like me, that's problematic, because the results that I get from the DNA test are constantly changing. So now they might be telling me that I'm 5% Spanish, and next year that 5% Spanish might go down to 1% or might disappear. And so that makes it very difficult for me as a researcher to draw conclusions when comparing my DNA with my records research, because now they might marry up, next year they might not, or now they might not marry up, and at some point in the future when they've got more data, they might align perfectly. So it's problematic. I hope this has been an interesting introduction to this topic. If you've got specific things that you would like me to talk about or address or look at in the greater study of family history and ancestry research, or indeed in my own particular case? Are there things you'd like me to contrast? Would you like me to look at different services? Which ones are good, which ones are bad? Or just, you know, any particular questions you want me to address. Thanks a lot for watching. Please remember to click that like button because it really helps the channel a lot and our metrics. But also, if you're not subscribed, please do. I hope that I will have lots more interesting videos for you in the future. I'll see you back on the channel really soon. Cheers, folks.